It started as just another organ transplant awareness segment on The Tonight Show, until a transplant coordinator revealed that after 26 years of making perfect matches between organs and recipients, she could no longer trust herself to make the life and death decisions that had saved thousands of lives. The Tonight Show studio was filled with reverent energy from Jimmy Fallon's commitment to raising awareness about organ transplantation and the medical professionals who work to connect donors with recipients. Tonight's focus was on transplant coordination and the complex medical matching process, and Jimmy had assembled transplant surgeons, organ recipients, donor families, and coordinators who understood the intricate science of organ allocation. The segment was designed to educate viewers about organ transplantation while honoring coordinators who manage the complex process of matching organs with recipients. Jimmy understood that behind every successful transplant was someone who had made precise medical decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Among the guests was Sarah Mitchell, a 48-year-old transplant coordinator at Regional Transplant Center for over 2.5 decades. Sarah was professional looking, with shoulder-length brown hair and intelligent hazel eyes, wearing a medical center blazer, and her careful, measured way of speaking suggested someone accustomed to making decisions where precision was literally life and death. There was hesitancy in her responses, and she paused before answering questions, suggesting her confidence in decision-making had been fundamentally shaken. Sarah represented the specialized coordinators across America who worked in organ procurement organizations and transplant centers, managing the complex medical and logistical process of matching donated organs with recipients on waiting lists, requiring extensive medical knowledge, analytical skills, and the ability to make critical decisions under extreme time pressure. Jimmy had invited Sarah to share insights about transplant coordination, perhaps discuss the medical criteria used to match organs with recipients, or talk about the profound impact of connecting donors with people waiting for life-saving transplants. It was supposed to be an inspiring conversation about medical advancement and the gift of life through transplantation. But as Jimmy began the interview, something in Sarah's demeanor immediately suggested that this would be more than a technical explanation of organ allocation procedures. Sarah, Jimmy said with respect, 26 years as a transplant coordinator. Tell us what drew you to this important work. Sarah spoke carefully, weighing each word. Mr. Fallon, my brother received a kidney transplant when he was 15. I watched how the coordinator's decisions literally saved his life, and I wanted to have that impact on families facing medical crises. The audience was quiet, noticing her deliberate, cautious way of speaking. What's it like to coordinate organ transplants? Jimmy asked. Transplant coordination involves split-second decisions about which patient on the waiting list is the best match for an available organ, Sarah explained slowly. You're analyzing blood types, tissue compatibility, geographic proximity, medical urgency, and probability of success. Jimmy leaned forward, clearly impressed by the analytical complexity and life-saving stakes of Sarah's work. For 26 years, Sarah continued speaking more slowly, as if each word required careful consideration. I've coordinated matches for heart, liver, kidney, lung, and pancreas transplants. Every decision determines whether someone lives or dies, whether they get to see their children grow up, or whether they remain on dialysis waiting for another chance. The studio was growing quieter as the audience began to understand the enormous responsibility that Sarah carried with every professional decision. Sarah, Jimmy said, in 26 years, how many organ transplants have you coordinated? Sarah paused for a long moment, as if the question itself required careful analysis. Over 8,000 transplant matches, Mr. Fallon. 8,000 decisions about which patient receives which organ, each one requiring precise medical analysis and split-second timing. Jimmy was clearly moved by the scope of life-saving coordination that Sarah had managed throughout her career. 8,000 matches. That's incredible. How many of those transplants were successful because of your coordination decisions? Sarah nodded, but instead of confidence, her expression showed something that looked like profound anxiety and self-doubt. The vast majority were successful, Mr. Fallon, but my ability to continue making these critical decisions is now compromised in a way that terrifies both me and my medical team. Jimmy's expression shifted to concern as he sensed that Sarah was leading toward something deeply troubling. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath and paused for several seconds before responding, and when she spoke, her words carried a weight that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something profound and devastating. "Mr. Fallon," Sarah said slowly, "I can't make decisions anymore." The studio fell silent. Jimmy's expression showed alarm. "What's affecting your decision-making?" Jimmy asked. "Decision fatigue and moral injury. From 26 years of making life and death choices about organ allocation," Sarah explained carefully. "I've developed analysis paralysis that makes it impossible to choose between patients who all desperately need transplants." The audience was stunned, understanding the psychological toll of decisions, where any choice means some people live and others die. Transplant coordination requires rapid decisions based on complex medical data while knowing every choice has life and death consequences. Sarah continued, tears flowing. "When you've seen patients die while waiting for organs you allocated to others, the moral weight becomes crushing." The studio was so quiet that everyone could hear Sarah's labored breathing as she struggled to continue. Jimmy's face showed the devastating impact of her confession. "6 months ago," Sarah continued with obvious difficulty, "I was coordinating a heart transplant for a 15-year-old girl. There were 3 potential recipients, all children, all equally deserving. I spent 4 hours analyzing the medical data, unable to make the decision about which child should receive the heart. The organ became non-viable while I was paralyzed by analysis." Jimmy could see that Sarah was tormented by the idea that her decision paralysis might have cost someone their life. 3 months ago," Sarah said, now speaking with visible effort as emotion overwhelmed her. "I was managing liver allocation for 5 patients in critical condition. All 5 were dying. All 5 had families waiting. I couldn't choose between them. My supervisor had to make the allocation decisions while I had what was essentially a breakdown in my office." Jimmy stood up and walked closer to Sarah, understanding that she was mourning not just her career, but the loss of her ability to make the decisions that could save lives. "Sarah," Jimmy said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "you've spent 26 years making impossible decisions that gave thousands of people second chances at life. The fact that the moral weight of this responsibility has affected your decision-making ability doesn't diminish the incredible number of lives you've saved." Sarah looked at Jimmy with tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Fallon, there are organs available right now that need to be matched with recipients. There are patients on waiting lists who are dying while coordinators make allocation decisions. Every decision I can't make because of my analysis paralysis is a decision that could cost someone their life or delay their chance at survival." Jimmy could see that Sarah was devastated by the idea that her inability to choose might prevent patients from receiving life-saving transplants. "When you say you can't make decisions anymore," Jimmy asked, "what does that mean for your future in transplant coordination?" Sarah looked around the studio, then back at Jimmy, taking several seconds to formulate her response. "Next month, I'm transitioning away from direct organ allocation. After 26 years, of making decisions that determined who lived and who died, I can no longer trust myself to make choices that require such precision and carry such consequences. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, what Sarah is describing represents something we rarely discuss about medical professions that require life and death decision-making. The people who coordinate life-saving treatments can develop psychological trauma from the moral weight of their choices. He turned back to Sarah. But Sarah, before you step away from transplant coordination, I want to show you something. I want you to understand what 26 years of making perfect matches has meant to the people whose lives you saved through your decision-making expertise. Sarah looked confused, taking a moment to process the question. What do you mean? Jimmy walked to his desk and picked up his phone. Sarah, you mentioned that you've coordinated over 8,000 transplants. What if we could show you the impact of those decisions? What if we could connect you with some of the people who are alive today because you made the right choice about their organ allocation? Jimmy looked into the camera. We're putting out a call right now. If Sarah Mitchell coordinated the organ transplant that saved your life, if her decision-making gave you a second chance, we want to hear from you. Use the hashtag #ThankYouSarah and share how her coordination work transformed your life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media was flooded with testimonials from transplant recipients whose lives had been saved by Sarah's coordination decisions over her 2-decade career. Stories poured in from across the region of people who had received hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs because of Sarah's precise matching and allocation expertise. But Jimmy had arranged something even more powerful. Over the following week, his production team worked to track down some of the transplant recipients whose lives Sarah had saved through her coordination decisions, people who wanted to thank her personally for the choices that had given them new life. The next week, Jimmy invited Sarah back to the show for what she thought would be a follow-up conversation about supporting medical professionals with decision fatigue. Instead, he had arranged something unprecedented. Sarah, Jimmy said as she sat carefully on stage, clearly struggling with the anxiety of being in a high-pressure decision-making environment. You told me that you're afraid of making the wrong decisions about organ allocation. Tonight, I want you to meet some of the people who are alive today because you made exactly the right decisions when they needed transplants. Transplant recipients whose lives Sarah had saved thanked her personally. David Chen, whose liver transplant she coordinated, said, Sarah, you coordinated my liver transplant when I was dying from Wilson's disease at 22. Your decision to allocate that liver to me saved my life. Because of your coordination, I survived to complete college, start my career, get married, and have children. Jennifer Martinez, who received a heart transplant, added, you coordinated my heart transplant when I was in end-stage heart failure with 3 young children. Your decision-making allowed me to continue raising my children. They still have their mother because you made the right allocation choice. Dr. Patricia Williams concluded, in 20 years of transplant surgery, your ability to analyze medical data and make allocation decisions was extraordinary. Your coordination work had the highest success rates in our region. The testimonials revealed Sarah's technical expertise, her ability to analyze complex data under pressure, and her commitment to ensuring every organ went to the patient with the best survival chance. As the testimonials concluded, Jimmy turned to Sarah, who was surrounded virtually by dozens of people whose lives continued because of her coordination decisions. Sarah, Jimmy said, speaking slowly so she could process his words without pressure, you told me that you're afraid of making wrong decisions about organ allocation. But what we've heard tonight is that 26 years of careful analysis and medical decision-making has created a legacy of saved lives that continues in every person whose transplant you coordinated. Jimmy looked directly into the camera. And to everyone watching, Sarah's story reminds us that medical professionals who make life and death decisions can develop psychological trauma from the moral weight of their choices, and they deserve support for the mental health challenges of their work. He turned back to Sarah, which is why we're announcing the Sarah Mitchell Medical Decision Support Foundation, which will provide mental health counseling, decision fatigue therapy, and alternative career support for medical coordinators and healthcare professionals dealing with analysis paralysis and moral injury. 6 months later, Sarah had completed intensive therapy for decision fatigue and moral injury, and she had transitioned to training new transplant coordinators while developing decision support protocols that helped reduce the psychological burden on allocation specialists. The foundation had provided mental health support for dozens of medical professionals dealing with decision-related trauma. More importantly, Sarah's story had brought attention to the psychological needs of medical decision makers and led to new support systems for healthcare professionals whose work required life and death choices. Sarah learned that her impact on transplant medicine didn't depend on her ability to make rapid allocation decisions, but on her understanding of the medical and ethical complexities of organ matching, and that her training and protocol development continued to save lives through every coordinator she mentored. The thousands of people whose lives she had saved through perfect organ matches learned that sometimes the greatest gift they could give their coordinator was the reminder that careful decisions create careful outcomes, and that analysis guided by compassion always leads to the right choice. Because sometimes the people who make impossible decisions need to be reminded that they have created possibility through precision, and that 26 years of choosing life through organ allocation creates understanding of medical ethics that continues to guide perfect matches long after the original decision maker steps away from the choice.